Welcome, everyone, to our YIMBY Neoliberal event for May 2021 called The Captured Housing Market or The Captured Economy. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Professor David Schleicher and Steve Teles. David Schleicher is a professor of law at Yale Law School and is an expert in land use, local government law, federalism, and state and local finance. So his scholarship focuses on state and local elections, the relationship between local government law and agglomeration, economics, and pathologies in land use politics and procedure. He's been called, quote, the most important thinker we have on the subject of local government, and, quote, ingenious by the National Review, and one of the most interesting writers on land use by Washington Monthly. His work's been described as interesting by The Nation, clever by The Economist, neat by Slate, and prescient by City Observatory, excellent by Forbes, and he's been discussed extensively in The Atlantic, National Affairs, Reuters, and a number of other places. And Steve Teles is a professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University and a senior fellow at the Niskanen Center. He's the author of The Captured Economy, How the Powerful Enrich Themselves, Slow Down Growth, and Increase Inequality. That is available on Amazon, unless there's a preferred distribution route. Steve, I highly recommend it. It's a great read. It is one of the first things I think I've read on regulatory capture. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our host, Alam Virani, to lead the way.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alam. I am some random dude. No, it's just some guy. No, I am also a lead at YIMBY Neoliberal, apparently. I don't know when that happened, but it happened. Yeah, and I'm really excited to host this talk. I think this is going to be a really interesting topic. I'm going to read an introductory paragraph right now and then kick off the discussion. So what is this talk about? Well, in the past few years, we've witnessed a marked increase in economic anxiety, populism, and general social malaise. And the prevalent view is that economic inequality brought on by an excess of deregulation and deference to free markets is at the heart of these changes. This view holds that while deregulation can lead to economic prosperity, it also leads to growing inequality. And as such, in order to combat inequality and thereby populism and other social ills that are sort of intertwined with inequality, we must swing the pendulum away from economic growth and towards government regulation. However, this view seems to have the relation between inequality, economic growth, and regulation backwards. Far from combating inequality, regulatory capture and economic rent seeking decrease economic growth and increase economic inequality. Inspired by the captured economy, this panel will discuss the relationship between inequality, economic growth, and regulation. So starting us off, Stephen. I realize there's two Stevens, but when I say Stephen, I'm going to refer to Dr. Teles. Stephen, why don't you start us off with what is actually regulatory state capture, and as espoused in your book, and maybe how does it come about politically speaking, and how does it sustain itself, and how can we combat it?
Yeah. So I'm going to assume that if you're on this call, that the underlying economic problem is pretty well understood, right? So I could go into a long spiel about what are the studies showing the cost of zoning and housing, but lots of you are in the Bay Area, and you just need to look around to see what the problem is. And you could also, but there are also a bunch of studies that you already all know. So I don't need to get into the economics. And I'm also not an economist, right? I just rip off stuff that economists say on the underlying problem. My my advantage is on the politics, and in fact, I think that's David's advantage too, right? And so I'm going to kind of go through part of what I understand the underlying problem to be. And I'm going to gesture toward the kind of things that David cares about, but I'm mostly going to let David carry the ball on that. And I'm going to focus on organization, information, institutions, what I call policy image, and partisanship. And I don't think David's seen the partisanship kind of argument, so we'll see whether he buys this or not, right? So one, right, in a way, the most easily sort of understood, or the thing that when people try and figure out why we have this basic supply problem, the first thing people usually refer to is asymmetric organization, right? And this goes all the way back to the home voter theory from David's professor at Dartmouth, right? That this is very old, that homeowners organize, first of all, right? That they have an incentive to organize in order to preserve the value of their home, right? And importantly, they're in the right place, right? So by definition, right, they own property in the jurisdiction that that regulates decisions about other property in the, you know, where they are, right? So again, homeowners organize and they're in the right place, right? Renters and other people who would benefit from more housing are not necessarily in the jurisdiction that makes decisions that shape the overall supply, that shapes their housing costs. Therefore, they mostly don't organize, right? In many cases, right, they live in a different place than they would like to, right? So they're not even members of the polity that makes the decisions that are relevant for them, right? So generally, right, we understand consequently policymakers are much more likely to worry that opponents of housing will actually do something that has a chance of actually harming them, right? And so policymakers, we don't need to have a completely super duper rational choicey theory of policymakers to say that in general, right, the people who are going to show up in decisions are the people who generally are very highly biased against housing, right? So the second is unbalanced information, right? So even if we imagine that policymakers were not sort of rational choice re-election automatons, even if we assumed that they were actually highly public interested, right? And actually, we would be faced with the problem of unbalanced information, right? That the homeowners I just talked about have an incentive to provide information about the law, about potential impacts of additional housing, right? So they have an incentive to to bring information to policymakers, right? And because for the most part, they're often the only people who are present when deliberations are made, it's very easy for policymakers to imagine that the interests of the people who are providing them with information are in fact the public interest, right? It's very easy to imagine that, right? In the same way that you know, one of my favorite cases is that David knows very well is the North Carolina Dental Board case, right? Where, you know, and in that case, you know, it turns out that the North Carolina Dental Board was mostly made up of dentists, right? And the only people who showed up were dentists, right? And so it's very easy for people in that kind of environment to, you know, almost without even thinking about it, they wouldn't have to think about themselves as being captured, right? They would just be very easy just to imagine that that was what, in fact, the public interest was, right? So by contrast, right, renters and others who would benefit from supply don't have incentives to bring information to policymakers about the potential benefits of additional supply, right? And the consequence is that on any particular decision made by a local jurisdiction, the information environment will be highly shaded toward opponents, right? Third is what Baumgartner and Jones call policy image in their book, Agendas and Instability in American Politics. And so opposition to housing, opposition to supply, is supported by a number of very powerful cultural tropes, right? In some places, it's the suburban ideal. In other places, it's environmentalism or anti-capitalism or historic preservation. And all of these cultural tropes, which are very widely available, have enormous status in American society, can provide a very effective screen behind which to hide self-interest, right? And so, in fact, right, in lots of cases, policymaking is not, in fact, the kind of marketplace that economists often imagine it to be, right, where everybody is openly acting on their self-interest and bartering and trading, right, favors, right? People talk in terms of larger values, larger cultural norms, right? And the power of the norms that surround opposition to supply are very heavily tilted toward toward not building, right? And so again, these powerful cultural tropes provide a screen behind which to hide self-interest, right? And finally, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot, is partisanship, right? For the most part, when you talk to advocates of YIMBY type zoning reform, right? Often people say, the great thing with this issue is it's not polarized, right? And people go, look, lefties and conservatives are in favor of it, right? This must be a great issue, right? But there's a downside to the absence of polarization, which is that if it was polarized, at least you'd have very strong, consistent signals sent to members of at least one party that they should care about the issue and that they should participate in a consistent way in support of it. But instead, the absence of polarization means that there's really nothing cutting against the ordinary grubby self-interest or just indifference, right? So in that sense, one implication is polarization of this issue might actually be good, right? At least where, depending on where you think the polarization would occur. Now, David's going to tell you that the problem is that we don't actually have polarization on the issues that local jurisdictions actually deal with, right? So just to give you a preview of coming attractions, but that's a issue. So, okay, so implications, right? So one, right, first implication is the need for subsidized organization, right? That is the opponents of zoning don't need subsidy, right? One thing, again, Sarah Anzia has a wonderful book coming out, and one thing she shows is it turns out opponents of housing don't even need organization, right? They just show up spontaneously without the need for any collective structures to organize them, right? That, you know, they often form into very ad hoc, you know, participatory structures that then kind of disappear, but then they all reform and it's all the same people, right? But it turns out they don't need organization, right? But we do, right? We need organization in order to generate collective action. And I think that organization also needs to be subsidized in some important ways, in particular because there are some very important collective goods that are not going to be in the interest of any individual who participates in this to produce, right? One of those is information, right? When you think about all the information that you would need to be able to bring into policymaking context, right? In some cases, you may have particularly spectrumy people who are going to stay up until the middle of the night coming up with like research, right? But often, right, some of those people may be on this call for all I know.
Probably.
Yeah, but but you know, that's a case where even if you have people who are willing to participate or willing to show up at hearings, if they don't have a lot of stuff behind them to provide additional information about the law, about consequences, about larger implications, then you're going to be in trouble, right? In addition, organization can be very valuable in order to make development not costless in identity or reputational terms. So this is one thing I've been thinking of is right now, it's pretty easy for someone to just show up at their local, even quite left of center jurisdiction and say, oh, we shouldn't build this because of, community values or, it's not appropriate, right? And nobody just calls them a racist, right? And one way to put it is, it's right now that's costless in identity terms, right? So you can imagine you wouldn't need, right? So maybe Kathy does, good for you. But it wouldn't have to be just about a race. So you can imagine what it is, right? But one thing, it wouldn't even have to be symmetrical organization would do is potentially raise the cost of acting in what's effectively self-interest by sort of forcing people to defend what is in fact their self-interested as opposed to their public interested rationale, right? So again, connected to that, I think there's an argument for more explicitly tying the issue to high salience partisan values, right? So I live in Tacoma Park, Maryland, which is sort of like the Berkeley of, the DC area. And I'm involved in our local YIMBY organization. And it is the case, right, that it turns out that, people, at least in this kind of jurisdiction, really do care about what people believe is progressive, right? And if you convince them that the larger environment, right, that, you know, important high status politicians are all saying that zoning is really bad and racist and is going to destroy the planet, right? That, I think, is relevant, right? So that's one sense in which the nationalization of politics might actually be valuable here if you actually change the ideological axis of the issue, right? Now, everything I'm saying is mostly assumes an absence of change in venue, right? So again, Baumgartner and Jones say one of the causes of policy change is when there's a shift in venue, right? When you move from one institution to another. And I'm mostly trying to figure out, well, how do you actually change in the absence of alteration of institutional venue? But David is going to give you a whole spiel about institutional venue.
Well, thank you for that, Stephen. I have so many follow-up questions that I want to make sure I give a chance to Professor Schleicher.
He's doing a ventriloquist version of me. You can just keep asking Steve what I would say. It's great.
I will say, when you were talking, Stephen, what really came to my mind is just memories of like public comment hearings, like local public comment hearings, about how for the longest time, and still to a large extent, you'd show up, and of course, who would show up but like local homeowners? Like, there wouldn't be people who want to rent in the area. They wouldn't naturally show up. There wouldn't even be renters. You just have these like wealthy homeowners who come and just dominate these meetings. And then sort of how a lot of like local YIMBY groups have popped up to like counterbalance that, and also like bring to the foray like the idea of NIMBYism as a sort of a way of painting someone who doesn't want to allow for more construction in their neighborhoods. But Professor Schleicher, I'd like to jump in here. I know one thing, Stephen has talked a lot about different things. I'd love you to comment more about like what you think the political solutions are towards, just generally regulatory state capture, but especially when it comes to like local land use regulation.
Yeah, so I'll start with land use, which is that, so the first thing I think are one of the most interesting ways to kind of at this problem is to look at how people looked at the problem in the period before, or looked at land use in the period before what we could think of the rise of the land use crisis, or the housing crisis. And one of the central claims in that literature was that individual towns will be able to restrict housing growth. So your individual rich suburb will be able to restrict housing growth, but regions will not. There will never be a housing crisis at the regional level for two reasons. One is that there's going to be an infinite number of exurbs. There'll be some pro-growth suburbs, of which, by the way, one of the classic examples in the literature, amusingly for you all, is Palo Alto. So they're writing about Palo Alto in the 50s and early 60s, which was dominated by a pro-growth coalition until the rise of the residentialists. But
famous for being affordable.
But the other one was that big cities will always allow for more construction. And anyone who lives in San Francisco or New York, or which actually builds less housing per capita than San Francisco does, about half. And interestingly enough, by the way, also for you Californians, the New York City suburbs build at lower rates than do the San Francisco suburbs. So that the per capita building in Nassau County is lower than in basically anywhere in California. Well, some places in Southern California. Anyway, the theory why big cities, and this theory you can imagine this applying to any type of jurisdiction of large, even a state, was that the interests of actors in that thing will be homeowners will not be able to organize to control it, and what they call the growth machine coalition would dominate. And the idea was that some combination of big business, developers, construction unions, and importantly, not just construction unions, but municipal unions, all of whom have an interest in there being more people, will spend more money in politics. And as politics moves away from a participatory model for small governments to a larger model, these kind of big moneyed forces will win. And one question to ask is, this is not true, right? So anyone who lives in a modern coastal city understands on a fundamental level that this is not so. It's also not true in most state governments, although there's been some change in California to some degree. And the question is like, why? Why is that the case? And the argument I've offered is that it's been the interaction between political changes and and legal rules, the way that those two things have interacted have led to the demise of the growth machine coalition. So what does that mean? As political machines declined, political machines, notably, were largely pro-growth and pro-immigrant, among other things. So you think about, if you could think of any of you know the movie Gangs of New York, with Boss Tweed standing at the boat, adding new people. Immigrants were great for the political machine. The bigger, the better. They were able to overcome their goo-goo opponents that way. And so political machines had an interest in a citywide interest in the interest of the vote was either for Mayor Daley or against Mayor Daley, for Boss Tweed or against Boss Tweed. And therefore, they organized politics in a way that made politics operate at a citywide level, which gave the actors in politics an interest in growing. By the way, at the time, immigrants could vote immediately upon entrance. There wasn't even at certain of these periods, there weren't even laws that said you had to be a resident to vote. You just had to show up. That changed. You can kind of in different times at different places, but naturalization was remarkably easy at the time, so voting happened very quickly. Anyway, the demise of political machines, which can happen at different times, different places. Also, you see the demise of reform political coalitions. So reform cities, mostly in the West, also kind of lost their centralizing entities. And what this led to was greater, what you might think of as greater democracy, that individual districts no longer were dominated by the Tweeds or the Daleys, and it allowed every local group to participate in local politics and be determinative. So the question was no longer, were you favored by Mayor Daley, but were you favored by the people who show up in local primaries? And the effect this had, and particularly with the fact that local elections are largely dominated by one party, is that local legislatures ended up devolving to what political scientists call distributive politics coalitions, but the rest of us think of as pork spending. In the absence of political parties bisecting, so like right now, even though they've just brought back earmarks, they're not really a thing in Congress because it's not like earmarks affect anyone's vote in any meaningful way in Congress. It's not like any voter is sitting there being like, I have weak feelings about abortion or weak feelings about the war in Iraq or whatever it is, but like this bridge is going to sway my vote. That as parties have polarized in Congress, and members of Congress are similarly not influenceable that way anymore. But in local legislatures, there are no parties bisecting the electorate, and the absence of that, they need some mechanism for organizing politics. And one mechanism that emerges is distributive politics. And what the idea of this is that every district gets a little. And the notable thing that scholars of distributive politics have always noted is this can lead to kind of prisoner's dilemma-like situations in which the optimal thing for everyone would be, to take pork spending, a little lower taxes and a little less spending, but every district is so committed to its own getting its own thing that they're willing to go along with everyone else getting their own thing, because the worst thing that could happen to them is them not getting their project and everyone else getting theirs. And so everyone kind of goes along to get along. It's a universal loggerel. And we get, and the land use equivalent of this is what people call aldermanic privilege or councilmanic privilege. And the idea is that every individual councilor gets to decide on what happens in their district. The effect of this with the demise of political machines, and importantly, because land use procedure generally operates through zoning amendments for change. So we do things neighborhood by neighborhood. Should we build this project in the Mission? Should we build this project on the West Side? Should we upzone this area or downzone that area? Had the effect of, in these newly more democratic, in a sense, areas of turning neighborhoods into things that were effectively like little towns. So the way I've put this in many places is that for land use purposes, there isn't much difference between Greenwich Village and Greenwich, Connecticut. Greenwich, Connecticut's own political subdivision and the homeowners there, but it's no easier to get something built in Greenwich Village than it is in Greenwich, Connecticut. In both places, the individual homeowners, through their dominance over local politics. And so to me, the reform question is, what legal tools can we use to help us, and organizational tools, although that's not my particular bag, to help reconstitute the growth machine coalition. Because both Steve and someone there mentioned the home voter hypothesis, that no one's ever going to convince homeowners that they should change their politics. Their interests are too strong. And that's normal. Like, it's not weird or bad or surprising that this is the case. Homeowners have invested all of their money in the world in an asset that is uninsurable. And the use of politics is a mechanism for creating insurance for that asset. And that's Bill Fischel's big insight. And so the types of reforms that I think are when politics randomly chances you a type of victory, and you can imagine this both at the city and the state level, and I'll get into California specific thing, which I think is an instantiation of this in a second, is to come up with legal tools that force decisions to be made at a citywide and somewhat abstract level, rather than at a district and specific level. And the idea behind this, the goal of this, but both mechanisms are democratic, the goal of this is to activate different interest groups and different mechanisms for making decisions. And so the idea behind this kind of thing is to create legal tools to encourage the rebuilding, Voltron-like, of the growth machine coalition. And the tools, you can imagine lots of them. I have some fanciful ones, but there are some specific ones. So the existence of citywide plans. So think the Minneapolis citywide plan is which is a state mandated law that they pass a plan. They could pass any kind of plan they want. But because they're doing it citywide, had the effect of bringing together a different set of interest groups. Mostly, it was some ideological groups who organized around. So there's like whatever they're more neighbors, Minneapolis for more neighbors, something like that. There's a 4 in it. It's like the number 4. A lot going on there. But also importantly, business. I actually think that this, to me, is the single most important. Is getting the actually powerful interests, not merely ideologically powerful interests, but like, big business and big labor involved in these projects. And they became involved in pushing for a citywide plan. The California RENA process, as reconstituted, particularly in the last couple of years, has a similar structure to it. So the state sets targets for individual jurisdictions. The process, you guys may know all about it. The sets to these regional bodies that then set targets for individual towns. And the idea behind this kind of structurally is that it requires target setting and then makes decisions at an abstract level. How much housing do you need? And then, of course, every town attempts to break the rules and they need monitoring. And there's a whole politics around it. But I think structurally what's attractive about this model is that it encourages, or at least allows, space for citywide and statewide interests to push for change in a way that they're never going to be interested in local changes. So I'll give an example. In New York City, the single biggest employer is JP Morgan. Employs about 1% of private sector workers. JP Morgan has never lobbied on a housing issue in New York City politics history. Never paid any attention to it. They've lobbied for their own building of like a tower or something. Is housing important to JP Morgan? Of course it is. They could pay their bankers less if housing was cheaper. And they'd have the same real wage. But each individual project is like it's a very large housing market. It's a whole New York City region. There's no sense or mechanism for employers to become involved in politics, which they could have, by the way, in the era of political machines. They would have just supported the political machine or opposed the political machine, and that would have been a way of being involved in citywide issues. But in the absence of that, it's each individual decision happening in Carroll Gardens or the Upper West Side or wherever is kind of beneath their concern, whereas it's very much in the concern of neighbors. And so I think the types of structures that I find interesting and I think are likely to be effective are efforts at making the issue both citywide and somewhat abstract. That is to say that we have debates about how much housing is needed rather than should this building go up there. And then the big legal question is how you can tie those abstract larger decisions to locally specific ones. And all of the stuff that many of you all are involved in with like watching housing elements is all about this tying of the abstract commitments in the housing, in the arena and housing elements to the actually specific on the ground stuff. And so both of those elements are important. So I've blathered on a little bit, not the most organized sort of way, but this is the kind of my broader way of thinking about the problem.
So this is great, because I think I may have identified a tension between your position, Professor Schleicher, and Stephen's position. Sort of you're skeptical of local governance. There's this excess of democracy. You're skeptical of changing people's minds, and what you want to focus on is away from decentralization, away from distribution, towards centralization, either at the city level, where you used to have some of this growth coming, but imagine at the regional level, perhaps, or ideally maybe even at the state level, you're bringing up the decision-making. And I think California, like you said, has made a lot of progress, even recently with SB 9. There's been other movements with the RENA allocation, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, to sort of force, or at least strongly channel local jurisdictions to build more housing with statewide legislation. And a lot of the activities happening at that level. But of course, a lot of local, there's a lot of local movement as well. And I have noticed, even just in my time in San Francisco, that it does seem like even at the city level, there's a lot more success than at like the regional level. But I wonder if that's a tension at all with your point of view, Stephen, about how we want to organize and better organize local deliberation amongst people to be able to organize and locally advocate for changes in their communities, right? I'm not sure if I've identified a tension, because maybe you do agree with the broader point of what Professor Schleicher is saying, but I wonder if maybe you want to push back a little bit on that.
Yeah, I don't really want to push back on it. I think David and I basically agree. In that I do think it's obviously the case that, changing the venue and also changing the rules under which local venues have to make decisions. And that was the point about having requirements for plans, right? There, you're not necessarily changing the venue, you're changing the decision-making process that local jurisdictions have to make, right? And those would all be preferable. The other thing, again, that I didn't think, so now I'm going to go back to hand puppet territory.
Nice.
I really would. I would like to have a David Schleicher hand puppet, but it's creepy. So I think maybe I won't do that.
My podcast is going to have mugs. It's going to be very exciting. You can have it then.
Yeah. But I think the point is, though, and his point about sort of the growth machine and party machines is, it would be a lot easier to get the kinds of changes that we're both interested in if the advocates of building more were part of a durable multi-issue coalition, right? Another word for which is a party, right? Those parties don't have to be the same as the national parties, right? And again, I think this is the thing that David's written about, other people have written about, right? One of the basic problems in urban governance, right, is that most of our big cities are single party jurisdictions, right, effectively, right? And so we don't actually have a growth coalition versus an anti-growth coalition, right? Which would be desirable, right? We could have one party, you could call that party the Republicans, right? Or you could call them something else that wasn't as stigmatized, right? But they would be the party that was made up of all the people who are in favor of building stuff, right? And then the party was against, right? And then also the YIMBY people would be, in a kind of log roll with a bunch of people who have a bunch of other priorities, right? And, and that would be how they would sort of, that would magnify their power, right? By being in that kind of coalition, right? Now, I think it's possible to imagine, so I've also written some stuff recently about party factions. And so it's possible to imagine that some of this can emerge through organized factional conflict inside of the single dominant party in the jurisdiction, right? And so if you actually just had, growth Democrats versus anti-growth Democrats, right? Well, maybe you would have enough organized political conflict to organize some of those log rolls, but they would all be inside the Democratic Party. So I do think that those institutional changes would be highly desirable, but I do think we also have to think about, how are we going to be trying to get whatever we can get out of the institutional structure that we've got now, right? And that's not nearly as much as we want, but it may also be point that doing some of that organizing within our current context may be valuable simply for building up a mass of people who are engaged, who are pissed off, who are working because some of those handholds are where they are.
Do you people?
So by the way, the question about should groups organize themselves as local political parties, or alternately should they operate as interest groups, is a fascinating one. It's something that is kind of a universal across people who participate in local politics. So think about for a moment, like the relationship Black Lives Matter groups have to local politics. Do they think of themselves as interest groups aimed at particular issues around police reform? Or alternately, do they think of themselves as having a set of stances on housing, transit, et cetera, et cetera? And the same thing is broadly true, I think, for YIMBYs in a question. It's like, there are downsides to becoming a political party? In a political party, I just mean a multi-coalition, multi-issue group, like stances on transit, so it seems pretty natural, deeply connected, stances on policing, somewhat connected, and so on and so forth, stances on sex work. You can imagine all sorts of things that groups could have interest on. Of course, every time you broaden the issues, you end up ending up with people who disagree, and interest groups can have the effect of, and these decisions exist everywhere in politics. So environmental groups in America are largely organized as issue groups, and in the rest of the world, they're largely organized as green parties. I'm not entirely, but largely, and that's a strategic choice that responds to certain political incentives. And so I think there are upsides and downsides to political organizing as a political party. But the basic point that Steve was making in his ventriloquist voice, which is that there's like a real challenge created by the lack of party organization in local legislatures is real. I'd put it a little differently than the way he puts it, which is that it's completely plausible that if there is party competition, and San Francisco, by the way, has like a version of this kind of in mods and progs or whatever. I'm not an expert in San Francisco politics, though I do highly recommend you to read my my sometimes co-author and very regular contributor to YIMBY issues out there, Chris Elmendorf, which is a wonderful paper where he did polling and tried to show that like mods and progs are stable coalitions, but voters don't actually vote that clearly on them, which is a really interesting project, but I can leave that aside with Cheryl Boudreau. But the absence of party competition is necessarily related to the existence of aldermanic privilege as a institutional form. And by the way, one thing I'd add to this is that law ends up instantiating whatever a political coalition is dominant. And so one thing we see is that, and then making it harder to dislodge, is that local laws and local processes reflect the institution of aldermanic privilege. Let me give an example. In New York, we have a whole process for making land use changes called ULURP. People in land use can't avoid acronyms. And ULURP has to be the ugliest of all of them. It's even worse than Lulu. ULURP is the worst. But ULURP is the Uniform Land Use Review Procedure, and it requires starting off with increasingly entirely local meetings, and these meetings are theoretically advisory, going through appointed community boards. In DC, you have elected advisory neighborhood councils that are also themselves making mostly advisory recommendations. But why is this important? These local meetings serve as organizing hubs for opponents to housing. Like that's their legal function effectively is in a famous article, I would say famous, like a Taylor Swift. My colleague used an article in 1973. It's not Taylor Swift. It's like I wrote an article in the University of Chicago Law that described homeowners as homeowner cartels. And anyone who knows anything about cartels knows cartels are unstable. Like everyone has an incentive to defect. If you think about homeowners trying to block housing, like any one of them who was allowed to build housing would gain a huge amount, right? So like if everyone else has a single family and you could build a tower, well, you're a rich guy and that's awesome. These local organizing hubs serve as mechanisms for policing cartels. And one thing where Steve and I agree, we agree on a lot of stuff, but one thing that we do agree is that ideology plays a similar role in keeping cartels alive. And so Bill Fischel has this wonderful, we've brought up a few times, this wonderful article about like what explains the explosion of land use controls in the 1970s. And he says, in OPEC and Earth Day, and the OPEC theory is about the way inflation affected taxes. A little baroque, but it's the OPEC story is like, well, what did Earth Day do that allowed for? It was like, you know, the environmental claims of early NIMBYs were ridiculous on their face right at the beginning. Groups in Los Angeles, the earliest NIMBYs in Los Angeles, organized NIMBYs in Los Angeles, grew out of the zero population movement. And so these groups would come together and they would buy condoms to send to Africa because they didn't want more babies born. And they'd oppose building the Hollywood Hills. And they told themselves that this was part of the same political coalition. And like, everyone knows this is nonsensical. Like, this is just dumb. But it made sense because it was something you could say at a meeting that wasn't, I'd like to be richer. And ideology plays this role. And so those are two sets of thought. There's a, yeah. Sorry, go ahead. No, so they're great questions to the thing I would get to in a second. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, wait, am I muted? Oh, sorry, go ahead and finish.
Now you're good.
Yeah.
No. Chris asks, have there been efforts to modernize to local political parties? The answer is not. There have been a few here and there. One of the most famous is in Cincinnati, the Reform Party of Cincinnati, which was an independent third party, which among other things brought Cincinnati is a very unique and strange electoral system that the details of which are longer, but it actually led to being elected. The Reform Party led to the election of Jerry Springer as mayor, which is a kind of fun fact. But there are local only political parties in North America. The two most well known are in Vancouver, has local only political party. For one of them is confusingly named the Nonpartisan Alliance, and then there's like a variety of other ones. Vision Vancouver, they've kind of come and gone over the years. Another one is in Montreal, yeah, which has like weird. Their party system is all messed up because it's like trying to be independent. And
Vision Montreal
things going on, but they have local only party. And notably, by the way, like Vancouver has many land use problems, but it's actually been a lot of those are not in the city itself. Vancouver, the city, has been pretty good. It's got all those cool glass towers. They're the nation's leader, the continent's leader in the production of ADUs. And so, but great question, Chris.
Yeah.
I want to jump in and give my perspective as a local political activist who deals with dysfunctional local governments all the time and with a strong intersection in YIMBYism. Professor Schleicher, you referred, this is a great phrase, you referred to the homeownership cartel and how in cartels there's always an incentive to defect. And so we've allowed the rise of zoning rules and other regulatory capture to kind of legislate the defection out of the realm of possibility. And so I'm curious to get your take on the historic strategy of YIMBYism and how I think it might develop in the future. And to me, this is largely informed by Jerusalem Dimsas's recent reporting on perspectives, like people were polled about how they respond to racial versus individual economic issues, and obviously people respond more to their individual economic situation than anything else. So historically, YIMBYism has focused on the historical injustice of zoning, which is absolutely true and is absolutely worth hammering home, that our zoning laws arose from racial segregation, and it was a way of working around what became illegal. You couldn't discriminate based on race, and now you discriminate based on attributes associated with race, which is wealth. And I think we've seen, at least in San Francisco, at the local level, really small localities, that that messaging doesn't work at changing the political alliances. And from what I've read from Jerusalem and what I'm thinking now in terms of shifting elections in San Francisco, that we should start focusing on that incentive to defect. How if we were to upzone, if we were to repeal these laws, then individual homeowners could get very wealthy very quickly by selling their home to a developer. So what's your take on that? But I'd like to hear from both of you on that.
Okay, so I think I don't know whether it was Jerusalem or as Matt on their podcast described me as super old school and normie in my focus on economic growth. I forgot which one it was. It was one of them described me as in this way. But I am it was Matt. It was Matt. So it was I like I think the question to ask in these situations is not just what will be popular, but what is likely to bring in like organized political muscle on some fundamental level. And the growth, the issue, reason I think focusing on growth is useful is not just that I think it appeals to more people, although I do think it appeals to more people, but that's, you know, you can read polling as well as I can. I don't have any particular insight into that question, but rather that it encourages the questions to be asked in a way that is, I think, a little more feasible to answer and more likely to bring in groups like business and labor kind of into the mix. And what do I mean by that? If you ask the question, how much housing does San Francisco need? That's at least a theoretically plausibly answerable question. If you ask the question, how will building a new building on this block affect the broader problems of racial justice in America? It's a hard one to get your hands around. And so I think that racial framings can provide certain benefits for bringing in certain groups into politics, and particularly in very left-wing cities, it has its appeals. And so I think that there are situations in which that makes sense. On the other hand, in terms of bringing in this stable, long-running political coalition, focusing on growth, I think is a politically healthier or more likely to succeed in the long run type of answer. Though, you know, like everybody, I think I recently said on a podcast that if you look to your law professors for moral vision, you're like looking in the wrong place. I could talk about technical solutions to things, but in terms of like what will excite people, it's like you gotta, you know, there's other people are far more expert than me. But I do think the bigger question is how can you get like the permanent interests involved? And the reason is, so there's a famous line from, I keep saying that, George Washington Plunkett, who is the writer about politics, a member of Tammany Hall, and was this kind of classic, just said, reform is a morning glory, but the party is an old oak. And what did he mean? He said, well, look, like ideological movements come and go, but political parties, which have a direct link to the party ballot and have organization, and relatedly have relationships to the permanent government, business and labor, give or take, can survive in multiple types of ideological situations. And so it's better to be an oak than to be it's better to be an oak. So I will just say that's my instinct on that question. But I'm curious what other people think.
I mean, one thing I'd like to add as color to this question is sort of there's this debate or tension maybe between being an issue-led movement specifically on housing in the way that some, you know, environmental movements try to be very focused on climate change or on greenhouse emissions, versus much more partisan-based movements. You think how environmental movements sometimes in Europe and actually in Canada can often be like political parties. And even at the local level or at the regional or state level, you can think about how you might want to fold political movements, housing or pro-growth movements into larger electoral politics. But is there a certain tension there, I wonder, doesn't that presuppose trying to build political movements within a party that we can change people's minds? And that, the nice thing about an issue focus as opposed to a partisan focus is we don't have to necessarily say like, hey, let's get the entire Democratic Party on our side. We can kind of pick and choose of like, economic groups which tend to be more conservative, and we can say like, oh, but these are renters might be more interested in like getting rents down, and these people are going to be like unions, and they might be more interested in building stuff, and what not. And I wonder how we solve that tension, because obviously on the one hand, it's nice to be politically active, like you have power if you take over the Democratic Party, but it's also a tension there where I'm skeptical to what degree we can convince like the large swath of one political party or another, whether it be Democratic, Republican, or at the local level. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, one way to go back to David's point, and I should note that I'm dramatically fading at this point, so I probably got 10 more minutes before I go into complete shutdown.
That's 100% fair.
So, I mean, I do think one distinction between what I'm thinking about and what I'm focusing on and what David is I think David is focused on how would people behave politically if we were able to alter the institutions in which they were operating, right? And I think the point is, well, if you change those institutions somehow, and that's the point, right? Then people, you would unlock a lot of different kinds of behavior, right? But that still begs the question of how you get the political support to alter the institutions in the first place, right? And that's where I think you have to have some theory of organization, identity, all that other stuff, right? And again, this is why these things are not mutually exclusive. And I do think in lots of these cases that one mistake often people make is they think they're gonna bludgeon people over the head with enough data, right, that it's gonna change their preferences. And for the most part, right, and I wrote a whole book called Prison Break, which I don't actually have the ability to hold up now, right? But I say, look, if you look at conservatives, right, up until quite recently, there was a lot of change in conservative opinion on criminal justice. And that was not in the first instance because they changed people's, they gave them new information, right? It's that they gave them an alternative frame in which to understand what the issue was about. And having then changed that frame, people became open to information that they had previously excluded or just had found ways to censor from their processing, right? So I do think making some of this information more identity appropriate and identity available, right, is the kind of thing that organizing does, right? That's what organizers ultimately are good at doing, right? What party entrepreneurs are good at doing, right? You change those institutions and then that has both, yikes. Sorry, I guess.
Sorry, the light just went out. I'll be right back.
Oh God, he went all like Blair Witch Project on me. Right. So I think that's one way to think about the balance here, right? Is you need to have some theory of how you would get that institutional change that then would unlock new kinds of forms of behavior. And I think that's why, again, what I'm talking about, what David's talking about, I think are two great tastes that taste great together.
Yeah, so I mean, this is Kathy brought this up in that thing, like, what about the grassroots as a type of question, which is, I mean, I like the one of these things is, again, it's like obviously grassroots politics and elite politics work hand in hand on some level, like they're related to one another on some level. There can be conflicts between elite strategies and grassroots ones. The things I've been talking about are very focused on a kind of a form of elite politics, and a non and that's not to say there isn't value in like getting the people riled up and showing up at meetings is extraordinarily valuable, and there's a lot of evidence that shows that that's the case. So I wouldn't, there are strategic choices that will at some point come in some kind of conflict here. And so Stephen brought up one, which is like, should organized groups push a growth story or a racial justice story as their main narrative for why something should happen? And you could imagine those having different effects on like the Chamber of Commerce and people who are likely to show up at meetings. Though again, I'm not sure exactly that it would. You know, you could tell the stories in both directions on both of those groups. So it is a but I do think that it is definitely the case that it is that some of these papers have I have a line which is like, well, elections are stochastic. Like random shit happens in elections, but like that's just like that's like the version of the old joke about economists, where economists say, you know, 3 economists are stuck on an economist, a physicist, and a chemist are stuck on an island with 1 can of food. The physicist says, well, we got to pressure. The chemist says, we got to heat it up, and then the chemicals or something. And the economist says, let's assume a can opener. You can't assume a can opener in this regard.
Awesome.
I want to move us towards the Q&A portion because Steve Teles has to disconnect a bit early. And so I want to make sure that we get this question answered from Gerald Peak. I feel like you already answered part of it, but I'll read it in for the sake of the recording. So Steve Teles, Gerald was wondering whether you could elaborate on how the change of venue concept played out in practice. Like what does it look like? So for example, in New Hampshire, there's some debate now on removing or abolishing the Special Housing Appeals Board that provides a statewide venue to appeal local zoning and planning board decisions. How can we make venue change happen there? How might this play out?
So I can actually with this because my student wrote a really brilliant little paper that's now been about the New Hampshire Appeals Board, which I just put into the things. There's a little thing. I mean, New Hampshire, whether the New Hampshire Appeals Board is a particularly successful model of the types of reforms that Brian's very excited about it. I'm a little less sure. But there's always worry, like any venue choice or structure choice is still choosing among options that are supported in democracy. So like you can reorganize democracy in lots of different ways, that we have mechanisms for shaping the way we choose things, and those procedures have effects on outcomes, right? So in the famous Ken Arrow example, it's completely possible for a legislature to prefer A to B, B to C, and C to A. We call this cycling preferences. That said, the possible set that different procedures could lead to is still bounded by democratic choice. And so that in New Hampshire, you saw this reform that kind of passed in this weirdo accident that it passed in the first place. And it's a kind of an interesting reform. It's kind of a weak version, for those of you who are interested in this kind of stuff, a very weak version of something called the Ontario Municipal Board. So Ontario for a long time, and then it repealed it and then kind of went back to having it, had a land use review board, an independent body that would review all land use decisions. And it led to actually in Ontario, a huge amount of housing growth for a short period of time, basically until Doug Ford was elected as premier. But it was basically like a super zoning board for the whole province. And this is a very weak version of that. And the details of it are, you can read about in that piece I linked. But like, even though procedures can lead to different outcomes, ultimately you're still running into a problem, which is that although the possible sets that democracy can end here or there among the sets, that you're still running into a problem, which is that many people don't want more housing to be built. And however you organize politics, that will continue to be the case. New Hampshire is like Connecticut and like New Jersey, basically entirely suburban state. People don't know much about New Hampshire. They think it's like live free or die, or whether it's presidential primaries, but almost the entirety of New Hampshire lives within 10 miles of the Massachusetts border. And it's basically the exurbs of Boston, give or take. And pro-growth housing things have run into problems in these jurisdictions because it's like you took the part of the polity that was purely suburban and removed the city from it. And remove rural areas also. I mean, the rural vote in New Hampshire is like 11 people and we're freezing cold. I went to college there. It's really cold. It's so cold there. Oh my God, is it cold? There's snow up there. It's terrible. But New Hampshire is like a very challenging place. And you're seeing right now, Connecticut is debating some statewide zoning reforms, and they're going down in flames, not despite a very powerful, smart, well-funded set of organizations. The thing that I'd say about New Hampshire that is true about Connecticut is that in these jurisdictions, I think like a particularly elite politics strategy, which is using litigation is of a particularly attractiveness in a way that it might not be in other types of jurisdictions. The most famous version of this is New Jersey's Mount Laurel decisions, which are quite complex, but the state court engaged in probably the most aggressive judicial reorganization of local politics outside of Brown versus Board of Education in American history. And it was necessary because New Jersey politics was never going to produce any type of reform of that sort. And so there are litigation efforts in Connecticut that I think are like in some ways more promising than the legislative efforts, although of course I support both of them because it's just like a really uphill climb if your central cities are in another state. California, at the very least, has three major central cities and their suburbs. Like the entirety of those metro areas are all in one state. You get the entire thing. Whereas in northeastern jurisdictions, that's frequently not the case.
Yeah, so I'm gonna have to jump. So let me take one crack at this, and then I'm gonna have to jump and then go die.
Thank you for being a trooper, by the way. I know you were feeling like.
So one way to think, I mean, David's point earlier, right? The assume a can opener point is actually sort of important, right? Which is that it is the case that in general there just the basic facts of democracy are just not very good for this issue, right? For lots of reasons that David has mentioned, right? But right, agendas are often have some random quality, right? So one thing that we know from, again, all of the agendas literature, right, is that brief moments in which something can get connected to something that everybody feels like they have to vote on, right, can often create very brief moments where there's a big wide opening of the possibility set, right? And what you've got ready when the possibility set opens can often be really important, because once you've gotten that, then all you have to do is play defense, right? And in general, the fact that our political system is well wired up for playing defense, right? For people who've already got what they got, we've got a really good political system for people who've already got what they want, right? And so essentially lots of the cases, what you're doing is you're playing for the moment in which some, often quite random set of things opens up the agenda, right? And then you've got the possibility of getting some of the kind of stuff that we're talking about, right? And that's where, again, I think organization matters, right? Because it determines whether or not you have like a vetted idea that you can tell policymakers is going to have a relatively predictable effect, right? That is, because during those moments when things are open, one thing policymakers might say, I don't know, we really want to do that. It might bounce back at me. It might have bad effects, right? That's one thing that organizations can do, is say, no, actually, we've got research that says this is not going to have some terrible effect that's going to end up hurting you, right? So I do think, again, I mean, you guys are talking about what it is people who are organizers like you do, right? So I want to be able to say what it is that's actually valuable for people who are, who are volunteering their time. And I think that's the kind of thing, is often you have to play it. And again, just to go back to another point David has, you often want to be promiscuous about what you connect the reforms to, right? That is, you don't want to be all in on economic growth or all in on racial justice or all in on the environment, right? You often have to be fairly open about connecting it up to issues that may not be the thing that you actually care about, right? And that, I think, is an actual characteristic feature of good organizers, right? Is they may have their own motivations for why they care about the issue, but there's no reason to think that the thing that's going to persuade somebody else is the thing that got you interested in it, right? So this is the last thing I'll say on this is, you all may be neoliberals, and I am because I'm affiliated with the Niskanen Center, right? But there are not that many more of us than the people on this call, right? And so, you really do have to have the ability to talk out of your worldview, right? And that's one of the things I think often good advocates or good organizers are good at doing, is, being multilingual in that sense.
The one thing I'll say though, that just so I can disagree, now that Steve's gonna jump off the call, I can disagree with them. It'll be great. Is that I think one thing is that the information subsidy that he talked about earlier and he brought about here is, I think, actually not a big problem in this sphere because of there is a huge informational subsidy coming from elite institutions. It's like I don't think the world needs more economic studies of the. I mean, Steve started off by saying we need informational subsidy, but on the also no one needs convincing on the kind of broad point here. And the point, I think there's a little thing I'm a little worried about. I think that researchers are getting bored of writing about this subject because it's sufficiently uninteresting. Like the economic questions here, if you look at the economic research in relatively recent years, it's all been politically oriented. So think about all of the research that many of you have, I'm sure, retreated on. Does new development have an effect at the neighborhood level? So if you put up a building, will it increase or decrease prices within a 4-block radius? Now, this is a question that matters in politics because decision-making is hyperlocal, but it has absolutely no normative stakes if you step back for 2 seconds, because who cares if the prices goes up in one neighborhood and goes down in another from the perspective of the city or the state? It's just normatively completely irrelevant. I mean, the people in those neighborhoods might care one way or the other, but if I'm the governor of California and the price goes up in one neighborhood and goes down in another neighborhood, whatever, it's fine. Shit happens, things happen in the world. But the research has now there are 15 papers on and there are at least several long literature reviews about the 15 papers on this subject because it's relevantly politically. And that tells me a couple of things. One is that the researchers are now getting very deeply involved in political decisions. In the political process, they're following along. How can my research affect this annoying thing that would not have occurred to them from their kind of ordinary social welfare function, whatever type stuff. And the second thing is that people are beginning to find the broader question a little dull. The number of research, the kind of impact of research when Hassai and Moretti did their first thing that said that the land use thing cost 8.9% of GDP annually. That was a holy shit moment, right? That was a really big deal. 8.9% of GDP is Canada, right? That's the entirety of Canada. Yeah. Canada's GDP, their finding is that by relaxing GDP things in 3 jurisdictions, San Francisco, New York, and Silicon Valley, you could produce Canada. And that's an insane finding. The 8th paper that says that doesn't do very much. Doesn't get anybody tenure. It's fine. Yeah.
I want to get going just because I want to make one other point, which is, there's a difference between, so now I'm going to make a pitch for money. I'm going to put a tin cup out. Nice. That, there's a difference between the value of the research that academics produce, right? And what you might think of as sort of direct informational subsidy to legislators, right? So, I'll just say, for those of you who happen to have money in the couch cushions, the Niskanen Center would like to have a zoning program and a full-time person on it, right? And we need money to do it. So if you happen to know somebody with an enormous amount of money who wants to invest in that, by all means, do it. But one of the points is that, David may know of all those studies, right? But I actually think the important thing is not that think tank people go and tell legislators about all the studies, right? What they really need information about is often how would you actually design a policy to actually do something that would not end up being something that sounds good and wouldn't do anything. So the example I would
lawyers FTW is basically what you're saying.
So, right. I mean, I do think that's actually really valuable, right? Because, if you think about if you think about the aftermath of Kelo, right? So, that, they passed a lot of laws, right, that seem to be sort of responsive to that. Ilya Soman wrote a whole book about this, right? And lots of them turned out to have been written by the other side, right? Because they wanted to have something that seemed like it was responsive and it wasn't, right? And that's where actually, just really good lawyering, right, by people who actually have thought these things through, which is more the real blocking and tackling of legislative work rather than the high level, Moretti kind of study stuff. I agree that you know, that we're getting into rapidly declining marginal benefits of that, right? But of sort of direct legislative subsidy and people who are sort of directly working with legislators, I think that's still a very high value enterprise. So, okay, I got to go, guys.
Yep.
Thank y'all so much. Anybody who wants to talk about this, you know, shoot me an email. I'm just steveteles@gmail. So
Thank you so much for stopping by, and thanks for being a trooper about this.
no problem. Talk to y'all later.
Thanks, Steve. We're going to keep it going. Professor Schleicher, you mentioned the Shea Moretti paper that said GDP would be 8.9% higher without
It's
zoning.
gone up now. So there's a recent Brian Kaplan thing.
I was going to say, so I'm dropping the link to it in the chat.
Yeah.
It's actually GDP, instead of 8.9% higher, it would be 36% higher.
Yeah. So here's the thing about that. I mean, so like I've cited this study 100 times. The underlying mechanism is like, I think the best way to think about it is like it's the high watermark for what this could be rather than an actual. I mean, what if the paper to work out, if you go through it, literally the entire population of Las Vegas would have to move to Los Angeles, like every single person and like. So like there's an element to which you say these things like it's a very, very large number. But yeah, okay. But like the entire population of Las Vegas is not going to move to right? Yeah, San Francisco walled city, right? But yeah, it's like we can say like the effect is large and just call it a day. Because also like 36% of the U.S. economy is like an insane, is like a ridiculous number. It's like, you know, like it's an impossible to think about number. It's like South America's GDP, give or take.
Wow. All right, I'll hand it back to you. Take it away.
Yeah. So Professor Schleicher, I want to ask you about sort of this elitist politics versus local politics, because I do agree, like there's room for both. In fact, both have to happen. But I'm going to read a question and then sort of expand on it. I think a fair number of households, I'm reading this question, are reliant on housing to build. Oh, sorry, this is the wrong one. Okay, I cannot find it, but I will just paraphrase it.
Here, while you find it,
Okay.
Joe raised his hand. I'll unmute him. Go ahead, Joe.
Hey, thanks for coming and having this talk. I had like two questions. One is like actually not very relevant. One is like, what are your thoughts on David Shore? He's sort of like a minor celebrity in our circle.
I don't have any insight. I mean, I read and I assume he's correct about things because other smart people assume he's correct about things, but I don't have any particular insight into like what's likely to move national level political party movements. Like I just don't have any, like it's not my I don't know. But you know, he seems like a really smart guy, and other people who I generally like. I mean, think he's quite right about the way these things work. So I don't know, but it's great. I mean, I don't know. He's cool.
Nice.
Makes sense. The other one, unless Alan, how's your question?
No, go ahead. Please finish.
Another one is like whenever I think of like law, like the study of law, I don't usually think of like how to structure politics to allow for better zoning. Usually I'm thinking more like if I shoot a goose and it lands in someone's property. So I guess like is this like a common field of study in academic law? Is this something like a law student can do?
Yeah, it is. I mean, the one thing is that as American law has become increasingly administrative rather than simply court driven, there's been a necessary shift in focus towards the way procedures produce outcomes inside administrative and legislative governance, right? So I've written a section of a piece that's called like property law doesn't matter. And the idea behind it is that like we teach property law in our classes like a famous example, like spite walls. So like there's this question of like, what would happen if I just built a wall to annoy you, to make you pay me to take it down? And the, of course, reason is that it's illegal to just build randomly tall walls in the middle of dense areas because we have an administrative process and a land use process that stops you from doing so. There's an interesting theoretical question and traditional, like if you'd done this in 13th century England, we would have had some interesting legal and policy questions about interpreting how the common law should be understood in this way. But as it stands, the way we regulate property, most property law questions are decided by administrative agencies, statutes, and so on. And so most law is made that way these days, and therefore it's what most lawyers, most law professors and most lawyers like operate, many, I wouldn't say most, but many operate in. But the other thing I'll say is that even very traditional questions take this form out. So like one of the big questions in constitutional law going back for the entire American history is the question of like the relative competencies of the federal government and states. And that's really a question about institutional design, right? Like should we leave things in the hands of the states, or would it be better if Congress had the power to decide them? And then how does interpreting things like completely meaningless things like interstate commerce, what does that mean? I don't know. Should we, and the way courts have interpreted them is through reference to policy ideas, and both original policy ideas and then contemporary ones. And so law has always had a very heavy element of institutional design and has always been pretty deeply related to questions of political science and political structuring.
Great. I'm going to jump in now. Curious about the advocacy around preserving the housing status quo and gentrifying neighborhoods fits your theory of housing interest groups. On the face of it, it would seem that renters are aligning their interests with homeowners.
Yes, this is a great question. Do you want to keep going? Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, I just want to expand on it because I think talking about elitist politics versus local politics, or even just the coalition politics, one thing I've thought a lot about, especially as I'm trying to get more involved in politics myself, is, everyone, not everyone, I should say, but a lot of people want more housing, they want more supply, but how it looks like is fundamentally different and often opposed. So some people want it to look like Houston, and some people want it to look like Portland. Some people want it to look like Minneapolis, right? In Austin, and I don't know, I'm sure Austin politics, but everyone wants more housing, but some people are like, we should build it more missing middle housing. Other people are like, no, we just need to build like these YIMBY fish bowls, right? And often there comes into much more complex discussions about, oh, well, you want to build on the east side of Austin, but that's a traditional neighborhood and that's going to sort of destabilize it. And people's interests there are not necessarily pro-growth, but stability and preserving, but building housing to do that. And other people are like, no, we are a business coalition. Our interests are fully aligned with growth. And so we actually want to push more construction in these neighborhoods around downtown, even if, that might create instability. Go on.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I'll say two things about this. One in response to your kind of expanded amendment to it, which is the questions of if we're going to produce more but still limited growth, where it should go is an extremely difficult political problem, because you're basically recreating a what people call a Lulu problem, a locally unwanted land use. We said new housing is something that places we're presuming here don't want. We know we need some more of it. Where is it going to be the easiest to do on some level? And this is a very difficult politics. This is one of the reasons why I think housing targets are, what I call them zoning budgets, are such an important idea, because what you want to have is a politics where any group that wants to say no has to propose somewhere else where something should go, right? So the ideal would be that if you wanted, I live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, let's say the city is committed to increasing new housing and there's a project proposed in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, the ideal thing would be for someone on the Upper West Side of Manhattan to have to say, it should not go here, but it should go there. And that would create political competition that would allow the community to resolve the question of housing in the Upper West Side or housing in, I don't know, whatever neighborhood you want to pick, in Williamsburg or whatever, doesn't matter. The idea is that as long as we each deal with each one of those questions separately, everyone's going to have a good argument at why it shouldn't be that, and they have perfectly reasonable arguments. We're this is a traditionally important neighborhood. This is a historically important neighborhood. This is a magic neighborhood filled of avocados and I don't know, whatever, like something. Every neighborhood has a reason why it should be somewhere else, and they all have arguments. And these arguments are all basically the same for what it's worth. That a point I've made to the anger of people interested in historic preservation is that the arguments for historic preservation, the arguments for large lot suburban zoning are in fact identical, right? They're about preserving a particular way of life in historic practice, whether you're doing it through formal historic preservation or through informal, like this neighborhood is a a large lot suburban neighborhood. Those are the same type arguments. And as long as the question is going to be posed seriatim, one by one, this is a impossible politics to overcome. Because again, every neighborhood has a good reason why it should happen somewhere else, and we're, once you've gotten to your if politics has proceeded to a point where places either as a matter of like kind of ordinary public, like it just would be embarrassing not to, or through formal mechanisms like a housing element, that say you have to say here and not there, then you can have a real debate about this. And you've seen some pretty healthy versions of this. So again, I'm not following this on a day-to-day basis, but like the fights in the LA region, like association of governments things, where the LA were like, no, we should put it all in, we should all put it inland. They say, no, we should put it all near the water. And they had a big political fight about like how to resolve that problem. And it turns out it's like super embarrassing to say, actually, we should put it all in the poor areas. If you're a rich area, like when Santa Monica tries to do that, it looks shitty. It's just embarrassing in a lot of different ways, and they lose. I think something similar just happened in San Francisco itself, with San Francisco's regional thing as well. And so that's my the first answer, which is like, if you're having the fight here and not there, and one of those is the necessary outcome, that is a difficult set of conversations, but at least a plausible plot. Whereas if you're having them one by one, you can't. It's just going to result in nothing ever being built. The second thing I'll say is like the broader question, like how to think about building and gentrifying areas. And here, there's two things to say. One is the kind of activist-y point, which is like people shouldn't view new housing as bad. And therefore, it's not going to increase local rents. And so how convincing this is to anyone, I don't know, but it's like true. But the second thing I'd say is that the one of the worries that happens in the context of like broad-based upzonings is that people believe that housing will be built exclusively in gentrifying areas because that's where housing is built today. And you see this in, there's a very unfortunate and very wrong set of academic theories associated with something called the rent gap theory that argue just this. And this is like extremely incorrect, that if you pass like something like SB 50, the first place people would look is not to existing, kind of currently with rich people want to live where other rich people are. And anyone who's ever known a rich person knows this. And so I don't know why people deny the truth of it. It's like people like to live in fancy places. And so that in, so those are two things I'd say about it.
Awesome. I'm going to call on Elizabeth Hanberg, who has her hand up and has been waiting patiently. I believe she has a question.
I got excited because you said the people in Los Angeles who were, fighting to put it in the Inland Empire versus to put it in the coastal cities. And I was in every SCAG meeting for the better part of 10 months, having that argument and asking them to please put it in, coastal LA County and coastal Orange County, because all the rich people want to have it go out into the Inland Empire. So anyway, I guess I just got excited and saw myself in something that someone said all the way up on the upper west side of Manhattan. Someone I know had just been appointed to be general counsel of one of the rich coastal towns in LA, and I was called and they said, what would you do if you were appointed general counsel of a progressive city in Southern California? And I said the first thing I would do is I would disabuse myself of the notion that your town city is progressive. Exactly.
What definition of progressive you're using, I'm not 100% sure, but opposed to change is basically the opposite.
Right. Exactly. So, there are noblesse oblige liberals who still believe that, rich white people can tell, low-income communities of color, that they care about them and that they know what's best.
Yeah, LA also, by the way, I mentioned about this up earlier, LA is unbelievably slow growth relative to the Bay Area even. LA is wild. LA is it is much slower growth than San Francisco, which is again something that doesn't exist in our cultural stereotypes. But
I was curious because you were talking about I mean, I realize I'm taking up a lot of airspace here, but
It's fine.
no, but you were saying that like we really needed to go back to like at-large elections. And I live in Orange County, which is like east and south of Los Angeles. And
I personally love the OC, the TV show.
Well, oh God, I don't live in that part. I live in the north, which is pretty much just like East LA County. Honestly, we have very little. We're very different. In very few ways are we different than just East LA County. But anyway, but the ACLU went around and sued all the cities to get them to go to district elections. Now, the upside is that we actually now have representatives of color. I mean, that is the upside, is that we finally have people elected to office who are, something other than Caucasian. So I think it's served a good purpose. People have gotten elected who I think otherwise couldn't have gotten elected before. But it does lend itself to, I talk about it as like everyone has their own private kingdom. It's like the Council of Kings and or queens, I guess.
So Michael Hankinson, who's now at George Washington, wrote a wonderful paper about exactly this in California, about using lawsuits under the California Voting Rights Act as an instrument to look at the way in which changes to from single member district to at-large representation affected land use decisions specifically. And what he found was, by the way, the ACLU was using the California version of the Voting Rights Act. By the way, in general, most at-large elections have been unwound due to the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, the Federal Voting Rights Act. And what he found was that this led to dramatically less home building. It led to a more equal distribution of home building, of the little that happened post-reform. Basically, the richest, whitest neighborhoods didn't allow building under either situation, but there was more building in the rest of the city. And once you went to at-large, everyone was able to stop housing from being built. And so
but I'm saying we went the opposite direction.
You went the opposite. Once you went to at-large districting, housing started getting built?
No, I'm saying my understanding of what you were saying before was that at-large was better than districts for the purposes of promoting housing growth.
Yes.
And what I'm saying is, right, so for whatever, the last, 100 years or something, Orange County didn't have districts. Most of the small cities didn't have districts, and most cities in Orange County are small. Yeah. And then in the last 5 years, the ACLU came in and sued all the cities to get them to settle, to force them to go to district elections. The upside is that we now have representatives that are not white who've managed to get elected. The downside is that everybody has their own private kingdom.
Yeah, and the result is clear. The empirical evidence, which I just put into the little thing, is quite clear that when the California Voting Rights Act was employed to move to district elections, it led to less housing growth. In fact, so your experience is that's consistent.
I certainly know in San Francisco, for example, we tend to have more success at the citywide level than we do at the local level.
Yeah.
And you can tell, also at the state level, there tends to be a lot more movement than at the local levels. And I think partly for the reason you said, right, this idea of when you centralize it, you gather in other interests which may be interested in more growth. Stephen, did you want to? I know you want to make up a point.
Yeah, so I want to bring up a couple questions and points that Kathy had asked and made. So one of her earlier questions was, if we upzoned all of New York City or San Francisco or LA tomorrow, the question is, would the new housing be distributed equally throughout the cities, or would it go into what are now low-income neighborhoods first? And that question ties into kind of what you were just talking about, and something that Kathy said in the chat about how do we make it embarrassing for electeds in San Francisco when they say we don't want housing here, because that is really the same thing. In San Francisco, for context, we typically only build housing in a few neighborhoods that are rapidly gentrifying and historically low-income communities, and the neighborhoods that are wealthy are protected from any change. And our supervisors they're not embarrassed at all. They just say, we only want housing where it's needed, right? And they say, well, obviously low-income people need affordable housing, so we should put all of the housing there. And like, you know, they're completely unembarrassed. And of course, we also have district elections. And I don't know, I don't think that it was really actually any better when we had at-large elections. Although downzoning did happen after we switched to district elections with
So two things. One is like the question, like what would happen if where would housing be built in a more free market-y system is like something that people have done some research on, and the evidence is pretty clear on this front, which is it would be built in the places where property values are the highest currently, for pretty obvious reasons, which is property values reflect demand, and like it's where it's in situations where, for a variety of interesting reasons, new housing has become available even at extraordinarily high prices in rich areas. It immediately gets built. And so let me give an example. Due to the building of the High Line, in one of the kind of interesting creations of the High Line, what they allowed was property owners right next to the High Line in New York City to sell their air rights to a set number of designated lots at an extraordinarily high price. It was very expensive per square foot. And these were things along that avenue, and all of the air rights were bought up within 1 year. Why? Because people really wanted to build in Chelsea. Chelsea's really fancy, and it happened immediately. As soon as the politics were created in a way that led to housing. That's an interesting story. I could talk about it a little bit more if you wanted me to, but the evidence there is pretty clear. Like it's again, anyone who's ever like met a random new well-off person who's moved to a city, like most of them move to the fanciest area they can afford. That's what most people do. Who they, like it's not universal. There's people have different preferences, yada yada. But like, I don't know. Most people are boring. They have boring preferences. I don't separate myself from that at all. The second question is like, how do you make it embarrassing? Part of it is that if there was a necessary effect, like if they didn't have to say not in my neighborhood but in your neighborhood, and that would have some direct legal effect rather than just being like not in my neighborhood and fuck you, that would be that would have I think would have quite a different politics related to it than just saying not here, if it happens somewhere else, whatever. But could not be. I mean, so one of the interesting things that LA research I was talking about earlier, which is that about the zero population, it was extremely necessary to get NIMBY groups off the ground. But eventually, once zero population movement isn't really a thing anymore, they just eventually merged into just being pure homeowner groups who said we're going to improve our property values once they were organized into groups. And so it's some people are completely shameless. I don't know how that,
I wonder if this is an argument for specifically pushing citywide zoning reform, so a la fourplexes everywhere or duplexes everywhere, as opposed to like allocations or quotas that you then sort of plan for. One of my concerns is that if local housing owners are really either concerned about their local environment, their local local neighborhood character, or their property values, whereas people where there's already some density are just concerned about rental prices, and the people who are like owning these buildings are not as sort of powerful as like an individual land use owner or have the same cultural cachet, then in the allocation they're always gonna be like, well, let's just put it there.
Yeah.
Right.
So my ideal version is something that is both naturally citywide, but then allows for individual trades to happen. And so the things like which is the city would set a target, and then you may. So my sometimes co-author where he argued this for Taiwan, an interesting idea, which is, I don't think it's like super viable in an American political context, but it's an interesting idea, which is you assign every resident of Taiwan a certain number of transferable development rights they can then sell to whoever they want. And this is basically a way of kind of using the surplus created by new development and basically giving it to everyone as a tax break, give or take. And this has the effect of concentrating development, because people will want to build towers or somewhat taller buildings. The worry I have with kind of universal fourplex type legislation, it's less true in the city of San Francisco than it would be in other places, is that in most places, that's not a super viable building type. There just isn't that much demand for it. You've seen this in Minneapolis. So Minneapolis in their 2040 plan did two things. One was famous, and the other one was no one paid any attention to. The thing that no one paid any attention to was they approved a lot of like rezoning along commercial corridors, like where there are buses and they allowed taller buildings there, and then they ended single family zoning. But the problem is that like that Minneapolis is like a hot-ish property market, but it's not San Francisco. The result is like, it's just like the demand for apartment buildings in residential neighborhoods of Minneapolis just isn't that strong. And there's some demand for and they made it a little more difficult than they needed to. And then if you throw on what you often do in these areas, which is affordability requirements, then the viability of fourplexes in neighborhoods, it's like if one of them has to be affordable, then you're not talking about a super economically viable. I mean, maybe in some places. This is something you see in all cities, which is that particularly where you put in affordability requirements, the only places that see building are the most expensive areas, because the only places where you could leverage the price to do afford. So like under the last version of mandatory inclusionary zoning in New York, it led to some building in a few hot property markets, but none in the Bronx, because it's just
they couldn't carry the cost.
They couldn't carry the costs,
right?
So this is what we're having.
Amazing version of this in Portland. Joe Courtwright has this really nice blog post about it, where the Portland affordability requirement kicks in at 20 units. And there's been a huge explosion of buildings 15 to 19 units and a huge crash in 20 plus units.
So we are pretty much, well, we're a little over time. So I'm going to ask one final question, which is a combination of two questions that Chris Harriot asked. So the first question was, have any large cities found a way to get away from aldermanic privilege without ending district-based elections? And I think a corollary of that is, have there been modern attempts to create local political parties that are, distinct from national parties?
So I brought up the Vancouver example for the latter of those questions a little earlier. There are, over the course of American history, a variety of efforts to create quasi parties in local politics. This is what I mentioned George Washington Plunkett earlier, talking about reform is a morning glory. Reform was actually a political party, give or take. It was he was talking about the movement associated with Seth Low, who, if any of you have ever been to Columbia University, you might know Low Library. Well, it's that guy. He was mayor of New York at one point. In some cities, this has taken some pretty dark directions. So in some southern cities, you had things called slating commissions that were basically like local political parties to tell people who the candidate of the local white political, like how to make sure that people didn't vote for integrationists. But again, all of these institutions live for short periods and die because they don't have any direct legal power. Like they're not getting qualifying candidates for the ballot. There have been some over time. Now, the other one is, how do you end aldermanic privilege? This is like a huge, the thing I'd say is that citywide plans and citywide deals and citywide rezonings can't feature aldermanic privilege. And so where cities propose, say, changes in the meaning of their zoning categories. So, R8 now has a different FAR quality than something else, or so things of that sort. And another example of this is like the statewide ADU laws can't be district-based because they're definitionally statewide, so you can't have all. And so getting rid of aldermanic privilege is a product of the absence of political parties in local legislatures, it's almost a necessary effect of that, or at least a very likely effect of it. And absent the rise of local political parties or national political parties participating in local politics, it's very hard to imagine it entirely going away. But pushing politics towards citywide deals will minimize its importance.
I think that wraps it up. So
yeah, this has been great. I know he had to drop early, but I want to still publicly thank Dr. Teles and obviously Professor Schleicher for joining us. This has been a great conversation on a lot of topics. I think it's been really fascinating. I'm looking forward to like discussing it more online later and just thinking about it. And thanks for obviously to Stephen Buss for hosting this with me and all the participants who asked wonderful questions. And look forward to seeing you guys at our future events.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It was real clam bake. I really appreciate it. So have a great night.
Thank you very much. Good night.